This lecture will introduce the topic of biodiversity, and in this lecture we'll discuss species diversity, genetic diversity, and ecosystem diversity. We'll then finish up by considering how valuable biodiversity is. Biodiversity is simply a measure of the diversity of life. So biodiversity, if we break that word into its stems, bio means life, diversity means variety or many different things. Now, when we are considering biodiversity from an ecological standpoint, we're going to consider it on many different levels. It's important to have a variety of genes, a variety of populations, species, ecosystems. Now, we also see there's an important variation in processes and functions within ecosystems, number and types of variants of ecosystems, and also the phylogeny should be diverse. One measure of species diversity is known as species richness. And so if you didn't notice, we're going to take a look at biodiversity in a number of different levels. And we're starting out by just considering species diversity. And species richness is the number of different species present in a given area. Now, what kind of numbers are we talking about in terms of overall biodiversity on our planet? When we consider vertebrates, which would include fish and birds, reptiles, amphibians, and mammals, we see that there are approximately 70,000 different species of vertebrates present. Now, the diagram we're considering here shows you also the vulnerability of each group of living things to extinction. So the little red areas of the circle show you how concerned we are with them. So when we look at this diagram here, we can see amphibians and sharks are are under threat with extinction more so than some of the other vertebrates. Now, looking at invertebrates, we can see invertebrates have upwards of 1.5 million different species. So a very, very diverse group. We can see there are many different varieties of things that don't have what we call a backbone or a vertebral column. And so really, invertebrates are much more diverse than vertebrates, even though we probably consider animals to be more of the vertebrate type. But we can see there's lots of mollusks, there's plenty of insects. Insects are very, very diverse, one of the most diverse groups on the planet and successful. And now when we consider fungi and plants, we have roughly 420,000 different species of plants on planet Earth and over 140,000 different species of fungus. When you add it all up, the estimates are that on planet Earth there's well over 2 million different species of living things. And that's probably a conservative estimate because we continue to discover new things in areas we haven't explored in much detail. The point here is Earth is very rich with many different species, and that's a good thing because we're going to learn how a high species richness in terms of a planet or also even in a local ecosystem is very, very important to the success and stability of the ecosystem. There's an interesting distribution of species richness on our planet. You can see that close to the equator, which basically runs through the rainforests here, you have a higher species richness than when you get closer to the poles. So there definitely is a latitudinal diversity gradient with many species found in the tropics and fewer as you get to the poles. And this makes sense when you consider the wonderful diversity that we see in tropical rainforests and coral reefs, all of which are very close to the equator. There's fewer species in the tundra, which is a more extreme and cold environment for species to exploit. Now, a similar measure for species diversity is known as species evenness. This is a measure of the relative abundance of each species. So it's more than just species richness. It also lets us know if there is a dominant species present in the area. So when we can compare these two hypothetical communities, community 1 and 2, we can see they have the same species richness. They all have 4 different species of trees present. But when we look at community 1, we can see the evenness is much higher, meaning each species is relatively equal or equally represented, in this community. Whereas in community 2, it seems to be dominated by species A. This one tree seems to be outcompeting the others. So as a result, if we compare these two indices, both species richness and evenness, we would argue that community 1 has a higher overall biodiversity, and more of the benefits that go along with a higher biodiversity. When we consider roles of species and how they relate to biodiversity, we need to consider 2 general types of species. We have specialists and generalists. Now, in terms of niche exploitation, specialists tend to exploit a very narrow niche. They have a specific need. So we look at the panda bear only eating and consuming bamboo, and koalas primarily feeding on eucalyptus, only found in very, very small geographical ranges. Generalists have a broad niche, so we compare like the rat and the raccoon. You'll find them everywhere, and they can eat just about anything and have even adapted very well to city life. Specialists are less adaptable because of their specialized needs, whereas generalists can adapt to many different environments, hence why I mentioned they're even adapting to modern city life. As a result of their narrow niche and their specialization, specialists are more likely to become extinct, whereas the raccoon and rats are less likely to become extinct. The specialists use a specific set of resources, and also specialists are easily affected by changes in their conditions, whereas generalists use a variety of resources and hence have a high tolerance for changes within their ecosystems. Now, here's what's interesting is both of these can thrive in a given area. So specialists can have an advantage when conditions are constant, but generalists will have an advantage when conditions change. So you can ask yourself, why is it today that more specialist species throughout the world are endangered than generalists? Why do all the generalist species seem to have an advantage in the modern day world? Well, it's because many of the conditions in our environment are changing because of human impact. And so species like raccoons and rats and cockroaches, things like that, are okay with that change. They can thrive. Whereas sensitive species like pandas and koalas, and many of the predators we see on land are having a hard time adapting to our continued development. Island biogeography is an important concept to understand in terms of species diversity, because this helps us to understand how species diversity is affected by important factors such as position and size of the community or habitat. And so really this is a theory that factors in how species diversity, essentially species richness, is affected by isolated geographical areas and their size. So we call them island, or we call it island biogeography, and when we're looking at the isolated geographical areas, we call them islands. But it's important to note that the islands could actually be islands, but they could also be mountaintops, because mountaintops are kind of isolated from other mountaintops, or even fragmented habitats, meaning a large forest can become 2 small island forests when they are separated by highways and cities and developments. So this theory suggests that the number of species on an island, again, this could be an actual island or it could be a habitat island in a forest, is determined by a balance between the immigration rate, meaning how many species are moving into and out of that habitat, and also its extinction rate. And so here is how it works. If we break down the island biogeography theory, There's two components really to consider. First, islands closer to the mainland have a higher probability of immigration, leading to more species. So when we look at this graph here, we can see number of species, that's essentially species richness. As you move further from a continent or mainland, you have fewer species. So we compare these two islands of equal size and their distance from this continent. The island that's closer will have more species because it's easier to colonize that island simply due to its close proximity to the mainland. Now the other component of this is island size. Larger islands offer more resources and habitat, essentially more niche opportunities, which reduce extinction rates and support a greater number of species. So when we compare these two islands, if this island is larger, now this one has more species colonized simply because there's a greater area. So we revisit this graph here, species richness will increase as the island gets bigger. Now again, we're looking at islands in an ocean situation here on these graphics, but we could do the same thing if we were looking at forests. Larger forest habitats will have more species richness than smaller. So if you think taking a large national forest and fragmenting it into smaller forests, that's going to have an impact on the biodiversity because those smaller individual forest islands will have less species richness than a larger one. Island biogeography, as a result, favors the development of specialist species, but it also favors extinction. So we can see many of the islands that are grouped together in these, like the Galapagos Islands and Hawaiian Islands, we see a lot of specialists that have adapted to the unique opportunities present on each island they colonize. But those smaller islands are also disproportionately affected by extinction events. And so smaller islands are great for developing specialist species, but not necessarily for keeping them around. And what we're seeing in much of our ecosystems nowadays is that human impact is fragmenting habitat so much, and it's happening so quickly that we're seeing more extinction than we are seeing development of specialist species. Let's now move on to considering another level of diversity, of biodiversity, and that's genetic diversity. So everything we've considered thus far is looking at how many different species are present in an area. Now we also need to consider what we might, you might look at this as like the invisible diversity that's present, something you can't see by the number of different species, and that's basically looking at the variation in the DNA sequences, alleles, and really how diverse the gene pool is. Why is this important? Well, a diverse gene pool is going to provide a range of traits and phenotypes which will increase the population's ability to adapt to changes in the environment, to adapt to diseases and also pressures, including those pressures from humans. From a human standpoint, diverse agricultural crops are very, very important because they tend to be more resilient to diseases and environmental stress like droughts. And this supports our ability to grow food or supports food security. Genetic diversity is also essential for the health and stability of ecosystems. Let's look at a practical example of this. So here we're taking a look at an interesting example of how genetic diversity affected humans, genetic diversity in crops, that is. So the Irish famine claimed close to 1 million lives when it happened, and is often referred to as the potato famine. The reason this became such a problem was because at this time in Ireland, they were kind of growing what we could argue are cloned potatoes. Not that they were cloned by like genetic and molecular technology, but they were so the farmers in Ireland were using just one variety of potatoes over many, many, many generations. So there was very little genetic diversity. Now, potatoes were the crop of food that was consumed by most of the disadvantaged populations and poor individuals in Ireland. Here is what happened. A disease known as potato blight came in and hit the crop, and basically the blight wiped out all of their potatoes. Whereas diverse potatoes, which we could find in other areas like England, they had a little bit more variety, and the blight still hit those crops, but only took out the susceptible potatoes. Those that had different genes survived and made it through the blight exposure. So there was still food for those individuals. So notice what happened here. Basically, having very little genetic diversity in the crop led to food insecurity and the death of and suffering of many humans in Ireland. And this was a hard lesson to learn, but we learned the importance of making sure we're maintaining genetic diversity in our crops so they can not be so susceptible to diseases that may wipe out the entire crop for a huge number of people. Another interesting example of why genetic diversity matters is seen in a local example here in Florida, and that is the Florida panther. So the Florida panther's range before the Industrial Revolution and before much of the development in the southeastern United States, the panthers could be found all the way into Alabama, throughout Georgia, South Carolina. But really, in the 1980s, their habitat had been restricted all the way down to just a small corridor in the southwestern part of the peninsula of Florida, really the Florida Everglades. Now, this is a concern for a large predatory cat because the Florida panther in particular had a huge range for hunting. It requires it to find enough prey. And so as a result of this, we saw that there was a big decline, not only in the habitat available for the panther, but also in their population. In the 1980s, there was as few as 30, even less individual Florida panthers remaining. And this created a problem because now, with such a small population, for successful mating to happen in this smaller population of panthers, there had to be forced inbreeding. They had no choice but to mate with close siblings, cousins, etc., things that as humans we know is taboo. You wouldn't do that, and there's a biological reason for that, because that leads to lower genetic diversity and more genetic health issues. And then we started to see that the inbreeding led to concerns with the Florida panther. It was decreasing its overall viability. So to fix this, we needed to fix not just the number of cats, but we had to fix their genes. And so as a result, they brought in some Florida panthers from Texas, basically a subspecies of the same species, and we basically brought their genes over to Florida, and they were able to successfully mate and produce hybrid individuals, and now the Florida panther population is recovering. But it wasn't going to recover successfully until we could actually bring in more genes into the gene pool. And so this is, again, showing the importance of genetic diversity, and not just crops, but in helping endangered species recover. And there's also lessons to learn for us as humans as well. The third and final level of diversity to look at is ecosystem diversity, which is simply a measure of the number of ecosystems present. So this is an interesting map here showing all the number of different biomes and ecosystems present on land on our planet. And this is important. The fact that Earth has so many diverse ecosystems strengthens the resilience of the entire planet. This increases what we call ecosystem services. And we're going to talk a bit about that in the upcoming slides. But it allows the planet to produce food, clean water, regulate the climate, all of these things which are important not just for human health and our life support system, but also for economic prosperity. An interesting picture here shows you how one region can have many different ecosystems present. There are 4 ecosystems present in this picture. Can you pick them out? Well, we have the lake ecosystem. We also have the deciduous trees, right? The temperate deciduous forest ecosystem or biome present here. You can tell their leaves are changing color. And then we have a taiga or boreal forest that is dominated by fir trees. And then a tundra off in the back, little grassland, mountain, what we call mountain tundra. So really, and it could possibly argue that there's a little grassland back here, but we're going to just consider that to be a tundra. So there's 4, in this one area, 4 general ecosystems or biomes present, leading to a lot of diversity. Because if you think, the lake will have specialized species present within it, fish, ducks, other types of birds that come to use the lake, right? So that environment has its own biodiversity. Well, the deciduous forest welcomes a number of insects and squirrels and things that graze on the leaves. Then we have the pine forest will welcome in a number of birds that nest in the trees and specialized insects that prefer pine trees over the hardwood trees that we see in the broadleaf forest. And then of course there's the species that prefer to be in the tundra and that graze over the grassland area of the tundra. So again, each ecosystem brings its own specialized and adapted populations of species, and so therefore the more ecosystems you have, the more overall biodiversity, the more they interact with one another and function to create a resilient planet. Functional diversity is really looking at all of the variety of functions that those organisms carry out. So it refers to the variety of roles that species perform, such as nutrient cycling, like the importance of cycling carbon and nitrogen and phosphorus, the different feeding habitats that are present, and even the role of decomposition and recycling important elements and nutrients. This is a critical component of biodiversity and really for our life support system. So a greater range of functions within an ecosystem enhances its stability, its productivity, and its ability to respond to environmental pressures. This is why biodiversity is so important, because the greater the species richness, the greater the ecosystem diversity, the greater the genetic diversity, the more stable the ecosystem becomes. The more it can produce energy and food, and the more resilient it is to changes that occur as a result of the influence of humans and also natural causes. So a graphical representation of may look like this, that basically as species richness increases on the x-axis, the stability of the ecosystem, stability of the functioning ecosystem increases. And this is because you have, if species richness is low, you only have a few niches occupied and very little ecosystem function or ecosystem functioning. As we increase the species richness, we have more niche overlap, greater diversity, greater competition, greater interaction, more stability in how the ecosystem is functioning. Let's take a look at how that might look. This is some real world data of how plant species richness, or the diversity of plant species in an area, affects drought resistance, or the ability to handle drought. And notice that when species richness is very low, there's very little drought resistance. But as we ramp up the number of species in an area, we see that the overall community becomes more and more resistant to prolonged absence of rain or longer drought. And we also see that the biomass increases in the forest or grassland, whatever it might be. But here, clear demonstration that higher species richness leads to greater stability and resilience and productivity. Another way to look at the value of biodiversity is to understand that they provide important services for humans. So these are known as ecosystem services, the beneficial effects of functioning ecosystems for humans and our society. And as we've studied these, we've come up with four categories. We have provisioning services, regulating, and cultural services. The fourth category is supporting, and more on that in just a little bit. Let's take a look at the first three at the top. Provisioning services are basically anything that is a product that humans can take from an ecosystem. For example, food. We looked at potatoes earlier, right? That's a great example of a provisioning service. Raw materials such as lumber. We can take wood and use it to create lumber to build homes, as a fuel, as fiber for clothing. A lot of the medicines we take come from nature. We learned about them. Fresh water, that's provided by nature, right? It's a product that we use for drinking, for irrigating our gardens, for taking showers, washing dishes. We use it in industry. So, right, it's something that is produced, right? It's a product that we can take. Regulating is a little different. This is a service nature provides that helps to regulate the environment, such as providing or regulating air quality for us. So a functioning ecosystem can clean the air for us. It's a service. It regulates the climate. It purifies water. It takes care of our waste. So basically every waste product is decomposed. So that whole decomposition of our waste is a service that is provided by nature. Pollination service is a great example of a regulating service, because things like bees and wasps and butterflies will pollinate crops for us, and those crops wouldn't grow unless they were pollinated. And so what a valuable service. We don't pay the bees to do this. No one pays a bill to the Honeybee Association or anything. They just do that for free as part of their niche, right? It's their role in the ecosystem, and by doing it, it helps to grow our crops. So we benefit from that service. Cultural services are non-extractive. We don't really take them from nature. There's no product. So it's a non-material benefit that really helps with our society and our well-being as humans. So I guess the basic one, the one that makes the most sense, is recreation. So every time you go to the beach, every time you go for a hike in the woods, every time you go surfing, all of that is a non-material benefit because you have a healthy ecosystem to go. You have a healthy beach that's not eroding. It's present there. You have a forest that has not been chopped down, so you can go walk through, you can go camping, you can go fishing, you can go hunting. All of these things add meaning and benefit to our lives, and we don't extract, and nature provides them. Healthy ecosystems provide that for us. We also have simply the aesthetic value of it, the fact that we have beautiful landscapes to see. Often, many people find religious connection when they're in creation at the beach, looking at the moonrise on a full moon, or walking through the trees and just feeling that presence and spiritual value. We also know that green space, trees, and nature is extremely important for a human's mental well-being and physical health. And not to mention the education, what nature can teach us simply by us observing it and being a part of it. We can learn so much from it. So these are all cultural services. Now, supporting services are a little different, because the reason they're called supporting is they are the underpinning services that support everything above. So they really need to, these are the important ones, right? So we look at photosynthesis as an example of a supporting service. So photosynthesis is how plants produce. It's primary productivity, right? Think of it this way. Photosynthesis supports the growth of trees, which produces food, right? Trees will produce food and plants produce food. They produce wood that we can use as well. Also, that produces the forests and plants that help to purify the water in wetlands. Trees help to regulate the climate. We also see that the photosynthesis produces the growth of trees that we used for hiking, for painting forests or looking at flowers, all of these things. So without photosynthesis and primary productivity, none of those things would be present. Nutrient cycling. So we look at the nitrogen cycle, very important for growing our crops, right? We need a functioning nitrogen cycle because that's a very important element to get healthy food. That also helps with waste treatment and disease control. It also, again, provides the growth of plants so that we can enjoy them. Soil formation, another big one, right? If we don't have healthy soil, we can't grow plants, and we lose all these regulating services and also these cultural services. An important study that was done and released years ago was by Robert Costanza and his associates. And they had the idea of taking ecosystem services and applying a monetary value to them. The argument is that humans are kind of living under this mental handicap nowadays, where the bottom line is the GDP and how much national product each country makes and how much money we can make from something. And we tend to ignore all the things that nature gives us for free. In fact, we don't even incorporate those things into our modern day economy yet. And so they went under this enormous task to go ahead and assign value to these ecosystem services. And the way they would do this is, for example, we talked about pollination services, a very important regulating service that honeybees do for us. Well, what would happen if all pollinators went extinct? Well, that would be a serious problem because then our crops wouldn't be pollinated for us. We would have to go and pay somebody to pollinate the crops for us. We would have to have somebody go around with paintbrushes. In fact, on some small islands where pollinators have gone extinct, again, an application of island biogeography, that small islands have higher extinction rates, right? Some small islands have lost their pollinators, and the people actually do go around with paintbrushes painting pollen onto the crops so they can grow. Or if in a more modern day, we have to develop robot pollinators, little small drones that would go around and pollinate the crops, where all of that has research and development and money. We'd have to pay for that, whereas nobody has to pay anything to the bees or any of the other pollinators. They do that for free. That is a huge contribution to human society that we don't have to pay for. So when the result of their work, this is what they came up with. So for the entire biosphere, which is really the entire planet, the value for all ecosystem services is ranged at about $16 to $54 trillion every year. Basically, the average is $33 trillion per year is the contribution of a healthy ecosystem to human economies. It's tremendous value, especially when you consider the entire U.S. national product is only $18 trillion per year. So basically what nature gives us doubles what we produce as one of the largest economic powers in the world, in the United States. So what a tremendous gift from nature. And the sad thing is not many people appreciate it because we've just come to depend on it. It's always there, right? So this was an important study, and it helps us to kind of see things in more of an economic approach to understand what's happening. And so when we look at these ecosystem services, now that we can assign a value to them, we start to see how they're affecting us, right? So when we look in the first column is looking at nature's contribution to humans, right? So we look at habitat creation and maintenance is number one. Number two, pollination. We've talked about that, right? And we look at the trends over the last 50 years, and these are trending downwards. They are being affected by human activities, and that's pretty consistently seen through all regions. And so this is a concern. We look at some of the other ecosystem services, air quality on the down. We can see regulation of climate ocean acidification, we'll talk about that later on in the course, regulating freshwater, regulation of coastal water quality, the formation protection of soil, and also regulation of extreme events like hurricanes, right? So we're seeing all of these in the past 50 years have had a trend downward. And we're concerned about that. And this is just half the list. There's actually many other ecosystem services that are being compromised by human activities. We're losing the free services that nature gives to us. This explains why sometimes things become more expensive. For example, when a disease affects birds, bird flu affects chickens, then all of a sudden there's fewer chickens, they're more expensive. We're not able to provide food as easily as we were when we had a healthy ecosystem. Let's finish up with a little practice here. So this is the multiple choice question. Scientists are interested in determining the average number of species that have migrated from the mainland to a group of islands as shown below. Partway through their study, they decided to include an additional island in their study group. Based on the theory of island biogeography, which of the following best explains how the scientists' calculations of average number of species would change with the inclusion of this new island in their study? So I'll give you a little bit to look that over and make your selection. Okay, the correct answer is B. The average would decrease because fewer species would have migrated directly to the farther island, right? An application of biogeography. Okay, here's the FRQ. This is looking at the biodiversity of amphibian species in this map. So I'll go ahead and pause the video, try to answer all the different parts of the this free response question. Let's see how you do. Okay, so part A, the map represents species richness of amphibians around the globe. Use the map to answer these questions. You were to identify the latitudinal range that has the greatest amphibian species. So you would have gotten the question right if you basically said in between the Tropic of Cancer and Capricorn, or 30 degrees north and south, right? That's, again, amphibians love the tropics here, right? Now, if you also, the second question, identify what biome this range most likely represents, and this is the tropical rainforest. You should have identified that. Part 3, describe one reason amphibian species richness would tend to be highest in this region. Excuse me. This has better conditions for amphibians, more rainfall, warmer temperatures year-round. Also, there's greater diversity, higher net productivity for more food, more niche opportunities, right? So there's this greater diversity. That's the application of the of that. There's higher biodiversity closer to the equator. Part B, there are many environmental threats facing amphibians today, such as deforestation. Describe one possible anthropogenic reason for deforestation. Now, this word anthropogenic you're going to see a lot. Fancy word for basically saying human-caused. So what is a human-caused reason for deforestation? So why are humans cutting down forests? Well, we're doing it for agriculture, to make more cropland, or we need the wood for housing, firewood, any kind of forest products, right? So you should describe that. Now, part C, many factors influence biodiversity. Explain how the species richness of an ecosystem influences its response to environmental stressors, right? So the response should have explained that ecosystems with greater species richness are more resilient or resistant to environmental stressors, because some species will survive, helping to restore and stabilize the ecosystem. Okay, hopefully you were able to get all of that correct and have a better understanding of the importance of biodiversity.